discussion. Okay, so just a reminder, papers are due on the 11th by 11:59 p.m. So you've got a little over a week to submit your papers, just FYI. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to talk about civil liberties and civil rights issues, some of which are unique to Texas and some of which we tend to see reflected in the national discussion. All right, so if you've already taken federal government, you know that civil liberties are essentially individual freedoms from government intrusion. Basically, it's protection from government abusing its power, not allowing it to lock you up indefinitely or prosecute you for being a minority religion. Civil liberties at the national level do apply at the state level. Every constitutional guarantee that we are given by the federal government has to be given to us at the state level. Texas cannot choose which civil liberties and civil rights to give us. They have to incorporate all of them. And it's because of the 14th Amendment that civil liberties were included at the state level. So our state constitution does guarantee freedoms like religion, speech, press, and assembly. It has to be written into the state constitution. But because we are a very traditionalistic culture, the state's been a bit reluctant to grant certain civil liberties, to take on violations of civil liberties, and to understand how important they truly are. So if you're looking at our state constitution, you'll see somewhere in the Constitution is all of the national constitutional amendments, but also sections on guaranteed civil liberties. Freedom of expression is protected by the First Amendment, so it does extend to us here in Texas. This is the result of a 1925 case, W01 v. New York. This case revolved around a man in the state of New York who was arrested for distributing a socialist newspaper and sentenced to 5 to 10 years in jail. While the court did uphold his sentence, this was the first time the Supreme Court said free speech applies to the state level as well as the federal level. States cannot prohibit free speech. And the state was involved in a fairly controversial Supreme Court case Texas v. Johnson. In 1984, protesters at the Republican National Convention in Dallas burned an American flag in protest. Mr. Johnson was arrested for leading the flag burning, and he argued that it was symbolic speech. And the Supreme Court agreed with him. The Supreme Court has upheld the right to burn a flag in protest as symbolic speech. So you can't arrest someone in Texas for choosing to burn a flag. Congress has tried to circumvent the court by passing a Flag Protection Act that would make it illegal to deface, burn, mutilate, or trample on an American flag. The federal court pretty quickly struck that down and said, you're trying to circumvent the Supreme Court and you can't do that. Now, while you do have the right to protest, you're not going to be allowed to hold a rally or a march if you're disrupting the activities of others. In 2003, there was an anti-Iraq war protest in Austin, where hundreds of protesters held a sit-in on the bridge over the Colorado River, basically blocking traffic in and out of Austin. You can't do that. You can't impede people's ability to get to and from the city. They were told that they had to leave. 50 protesters were arrested after refusing to leave, and the arrests were upheld. You can't block the entryway to business. You can't block off the highway unless you've been given special permission. They will sometimes shut down a street for a protest, but if you don't have permission to do that, you're likely going to get arrested for obstructing traffic, for not allowing people to move about freely. So if you want to hold a protest, you do need to get permission from the city. Usually you have to get a permit. They're not going to allow you to basically walk down the interstate without special permission. You can't just block traffic. Okay, so freedom of religion does exist on the state level as well. And essentially, What the Supreme Court has said is Texas can provide state aid for religion as long as it's not discriminating in favor of one religion or one church. So if, for example, we're going to allow a Bible study class on a college campus, you also have to allow for a Jewish student organization or a Muslim student organization. You can't pick and choose which religion to recognize. There also used to be a provision in the state constitution, Article 1, Section 4, that required anyone holding public office to acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. This does violate freedom of religion, and it has been struck down. It's no longer enforceable. You can't force someone to say that they believe in a higher power. You also can't force someone to swear an oath on a Bible. If a state legislator prefers to take their oath on a copy of the Constitution, that has to be allowed. In court, usually they don't use a Bible to swear people in anymore. But if it's there and someone objects, they can't make them take an oath on the Bible. And sometimes courts will strike down a religious practice or an objection on the grounds of religion. In the early 20th century, some parents said they wouldn't vaccinate their children against smallpox because of their religious beliefs. And the court said, you can't do that. This is a public health crisis. Your children have to be vaccinated. Nowadays, of course, that's a somewhat controversial topic. We have a fair number of parents who won't vaccinate their kids. So when there is a vaccine for COVID, the question is going to become, are they going to force students who have to get vaccinated to go back to school? And what kind of fight will we see over that? At the same time, if the local government wants to limit a religious practice, they have to prove there's some kind of compelling interest. So what happened in this case was a pastor of a church set up a faith-based rehabilitation center for nonviolent parolees, for people who were convicted of things like drug possession, drug use, and so on. The city then passed a law prohibiting parolees from living within 1,000 feet of a church or a school. The pastor sued the city and won, because there's no reason why he couldn't set up a faith-based rehab center. If parolees were not presenting a threat to the city, they hadn't been convicted of a violent crime, so there was no reason to say they couldn't live near a church or a school. This could also apply to a case where if a city decides they don't want a mosque being built in their city, they'd have to prove that it would be dangerous. And more likely than not, they would lose that case. They can't decide to limit religious practice. You can't tell a student that they can't wear hijab or a crucifix in class. As the result of national Supreme Court cases, non-denominational prayer, Bible readings, and prayer recitals in public schools are not allowed, because this was seen as essentially establishing religion in public schools, because the prayers would tend to be Christian, and then you'd have students who weren't Christian being ostracized for not taking part in this. If you want to have an after-school Bible reading club, that's allowed. If you can't have students reading the Bible in class, you can't ask a student to recite a Bible verse in class. And we've seen this being applied in the city of Santa Fe, Texas. Over 90% of the population is Protestant. Teachers were allowed to hand out religious flyers, invite Christians to hand out Bibles at schools, and have a Protestant chaplain read a Protestant prayer at school ceremonies. They also allowed students to recite a prayer over the stadium PA system before every high school football game. We were sued for this, and the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You can't do that because you're essentially establishing religion in public schools. And the state government had sided with the school, but they lost. You can't do that. You can't have teachers handing out religious flyers. Schools are allowed to have groups like Gideon's come in and hand out Bibles. We've had that happen here at South Texas College. They can't force you to take one, and they can't harass you if you choose not to. Right? If they break those rules, they can get into trouble. We don't want teachers trying to push religion on children, especially if the children are of a different religion. They may not feel comfortable saying no to their teacher. Here in Texas, the phrase "under God" was added to the state Pledge of Allegiance in 2007. And in public schools, after you recite both pledges of allegiance, there's a minute of silence for prayer, reflection, and so on. And that's allowed because, of course, you can just stay silent for that minute and not do anything with it. Here's an interesting piece of trivia for you guys. The phrase "under God" was not originally in the Pledge of Allegiance. It wasn't added until the 1950s during the Cold War in response to the quote-unquote godless communists. It's not in the original Pledge of Allegiance. It was actually kind of a political move to add it in the first place. It has been upheld by the Supreme Court because it's been challenged by atheists, and it's allowed because God can mean anything to anyone. It's not specific as to what religion, so it's allowed to stay in the Pledge of Allegiance. terms of the Second Amendment protections in this state, obviously there's been a lot of concern about various shootings. Sunderland Springs was a shooting in a church in November of 2017. 26 people were killed, 20 were injured. It's the deadliest church shooting in America. And so there were some questions about should you be allowed to carry a gun in a church? Now, there is resistance to gun control by hunters and a lot of arguments about self-defense. There's a lot of the middle of nowhere here in Texas. If your nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, you're probably going to want to own a gun for self-defense purposes, right? If somebody breaks into your house, you're going to want to be able to defend yourself. So the National Rifle Association has a little over 5 million members, and they argued that the right to bear arms is guaranteed by the Second Amendment. What people tend to forget about the Second Amendment is the first phrase of the amendment. The amendment says, "A well-regulated militia being necessary, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed upon." A well-regulated militia. That's been left out of the discussion. Obviously, at the founding of this country, with no military, no standing military, no police force, it made sense that people would need to own a gun. And now we've got this discussion about, are there certain types of guns that shouldn't be allowed? Can we legislate gun ownership, and so on? 54% of Texans do tend to favor stricter gun control. But the politicians tend to be more supportive of the Second Amendment. There's a lot of back and forth on this issue. There's a lot of debate about what happens when a gunfight breaks out in a church and the resulting damage from this. My volume off, it shouldn't be. Can you hear me, Johnny? Can't hear anything. Okay, that's weird. It says it's on. I don't know.
Jorgensen.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I don't know why you can't hear me.
Volume. I can't hear her. Dr. Jorgensen.
Yeah.
Dr. Jorgensen.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I couldn't hear you. Sorry, I turned my volume off.
That's okay. No problem.
Okay, now I can hear you. Sorry.
No problem. Better safe than sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then, of course, more recently, we had the shooting in El Paso, which was scary for a variety of reasons. But, I mean, the reality is, as big a state as this is, we do tend to see more mass shootings compared to other states. So, in the McDonald case, the Supreme Court said the Second Amendment does apply on the state level. So essentially, it's up to states to decide what gun laws they have. So it's why California can have strict gun control laws, and Texas does not. So our state constitution does guarantee us the right to keep and bear arms. And in 1995, the state legislature allows Texans to undergo 10 hours of training to concealed carry a gun. In 2003, they passed a law that only the state authorities can decide where guns are not allowed and not the local government. So if Austin tried to ban concealed carry, the state courts could overturn that decision. We also have what's called castle doctrine. In other states, this is known as stand your ground, where you are allowed to concealed carry, and you can use your gun to defend your property, your workplace, or your vehicle. If you're at home and someone's breaking into your house, you have the right to fire a warning shot at least. If they still come after you, you have the right to shoot. Now, obviously, you don't want people shooting someone without giving them warning, hey, I'm armed, don't come in here. But if you have a reasonable threat to your life, you are allowed to use a gun to defend yourself or your property. And in 2016, the state legislature allowed concealed carry on college campuses. You do have to be 21, and you do have to have a concealed carry permit. You do have to go through the training on loading a weapon, securing your weapon storage, and so on. We were at one point looking at open carry on college campuses, but there was a lot of backlash to that. I don't need to know you're carrying a gun. I'm just trying to imagine, you come to my office hours and you're like, I need to talk about my grade and I can tell you he's got a gun. Like, that's just not a good idea, right? I don't need to know that. So they settled for concealed carry on a college campus. It was funny because at one point, the students at UT Austin realized that they were allowed to carry a gun on campus but not a dildo, so they went to the local shops, bought dildos, and started carrying them around campus to protest the ridiculous nature of this policy. Yes, Johnny.
I know bigger campuses do allow like hunting rifles, but they need to be locked up at their either maintenance or administration office.
Yeah. Most campuses it's a handgun only. Here at SDC, you can only concealed carry a handgun.
Okay.
And I mean, the bigger campuses, like, it makes sense because if you're in the middle of nowhere, students may want to go hunting, and so sure, if they want to have a hunting rifle and it's locked up somewhere, they're probably going to let that.
Yeah, I know Kingsville allows them to have their hunting rifles, but they have to be locked up, like I said, in an administration office.
So that makes sense. That makes sense.
That was just my question.
Yeah, but yeah, so on most campuses, it's just a handgun. Just a handgun. Okay, but you can conceal carry a handgun on STC campus. And the thought behind that is, if there's an active shooter, and you have a good guy with a gun fight the bad guy with the gun, it goes back and forth, right? On the one hand, that can possibly stop a shooting. On the other hand, if what happened in Sunderland Springs, the guy who was returning fire on the shooter there accidentally killed someone in the crossfire. So you can kind of see it both ways on that. But the idea is try to stop a mass shooting by allowing people to carry guns on campus. All right. Abortion is kind of a gray area in terms of, is it a civil rights issue or civil liberties issue? They kind of go back and forth on that, but it became legal in 1973 in Roe v. Wade. The Texas may not like it, but it's federal law, so they can't do anything about that. And of course, you get the pro-life versus the pro-choice arguments. Pro-life arguments that it's murder, that the judiciary is going around the legislature. Pro-choice arguments are that the government doesn't have the right to tell a woman what to do with her body, and that decision really should just be left up to the woman and her doctor. Now, the state has restricted abortion access. If a woman is under the age of 18, the doctor has to inform her parents. She does have to get, it goes back and forth. On the one hand, sometimes she can get a judge to sign off on it if her parents won't. But usually she has to notify her parents, and her parents get 48 hours to try and talk her out of having an abortion. This gets tricky for a couple of reasons. One, what happens if it's your parents who got you pregnant? That does happen. Or two, what happens if your parents absolutely won't allow you to have an abortion? At what point what point is the rights of the girl? It gets tricky. In 2003, they passed a law that women have to sign a statement at least 24 hours before an abortion saying they've been given access to photos of fetal development and information about the risks of abortion and pregnancy. Now it's pretty much a 48-hour waiting period before you can obtain an abortion. You have to go to the clinic twice. In 2010, the legislature passed a law requiring women who want an abortion to undergo a sonogram to be told the stages of fetal development and what's happening with the fetus right there. Also, no abortion after 20 weeks unless it's considered necessary to save the life of the mother. There's actually only a couple of clinics in the United States that will perform what is referred to as late-term or partial abortion. They make up less than 1% of all abortions, and they're really only done because it's absolutely necessary to save the life of the mother. So it's extremely rare. It gets talked about a lot, but it's pretty rare. In 2017, the state legislature said if you get your health care through the Affordable Care Act, you can't get any coverage for abortion. Federal funding does not pay for abortion. No federal dollars for abortion. So if a woman wants or needs an abortion, the options are come up with the money on her own, try to apply for private coverage, or get funding from an organization that helps fund abortions. So federal funding has never gone into abortion. So this new rule just is really kind of redundant. But the other rule they passed is that fetal tissue has to be buried or cremated, regardless if it's from an abortion or a miscarriage. This is a little problematic because if you've just had a miscarriage, you're extremely traumatized. The idea that someone can tell you now you have to bury the remains, it's tricky. So there's been a lot of back and forth on the rules. Texas also tried to restrict abortion on the arguments that surgical abortions are not safe during COVID. The courts have struck that down. They also tried to ban medical abortions. There's two types of abortions. Medical is where you take two pills that essentially cause you to abort the fetus. Surgical is where you have to go in and have a doctor do it. Medical abortions are common for women in the first trimester. They're pretty safe. You get a doctor to prescribe the medication, you take it at home, you go to the hospital if there's any complications. So Texas tried to restrict medical abortions because of COVID, and the courts have struck that down and said she doesn't need to see a doctor for this. She can do it at home. There's no grounds on which to say it's not safe to do this. So medical abortions are still allowed. There's only one clinic in the Rio Grande Valley that's licensed to perform abortions. After that, you have to go to San Antonio. So they've restricted access to abortion, but they can't outlaw it unless the Supreme Court overturns Roe. Sure. I think yes. Yes, I do believe that is still allowed. They tried to restrict that in the last legislative session, but it didn't get through. So yes. Okay. Okay. I mean, usually you're supposed to tell the woman, but that's interesting. My guess would be that doctors are told not to here in Texas, but that if she had asked, they probably would have had to tell her. There's a movement against that. There's been some people who say, look, Down syndrome is not the end of the world. We shouldn't be able to abort a child who has that. In most states, it's still allowed. So she probably should have been told and given the choice, right? Because then she could have said, okay, I can prepare for this, or I can't do this. But she probably should have been told. So, yeah, that was a mistake. They should have told her just so she could be prepared. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. I mean, they've also tried to restrict abortion based on gender, like you can't have an abortion because you don't want a girl or something, but the courts haven't upheld that because that's more common in other countries, like in China, there's a gender imbalance because of the one-child policy. People could only have one child, so they would abort the female fetuses until they got a boy. So there's about an extra million men in China who will probably never be able to get married because of the gender imbalance. There's too few women in China. So they've changed the rules to where if your firstborn is a girl, you can now have a second child. And I think they actually scrapped the one-child policy altogether. So they're trying to fix that. But it does happen. Not as much here, but it can happen. All right. Education. This is an important civil rights issue for a couple of reasons. Civil rights are essentially guaranteed equal protection under the law. Protections for groups who have faced past discrimination. So basically, you cannot be denied an education because you're Hispanic, or Black, or Muslim. But Texas has had a bit of a problem upholding civil rights in education. Dallas Independent School District was sued in 1970 because they weren't enforcing Brown versus the Board of Education, which became the law in 1954. So 16 years later, Dallas School District still wasn't complying with federal law. They spent 30 years battling this issue with the courts because every time they would draw up a desegregation plan, the courts kept rejecting it because it wasn't good enough. So 30 years later, they finally said, all right, we'll comply with the federal court decision from 1970. So they spent 30 years and millions of dollars fighting this, and the end result was inevitable. Federal law supersedes state law. They should have just complied in the first place, saved the school districts a couple $1 million. The more recent case involves the North Dallas Preston Hollow Elementary School, where for some reason the people in the school thought it would be okay to put all the white students in one class and all the minority students in a different class. That's segregation. You can't do that. So they got sued for that. You cannot say, oh, there's no segregation here, but all the white students are in one class and the minorities are in another. And the federal judge said, you've basically created a private white school and a public school. So that got tossed out as well. So what we're seeing in Texas is more of what's called a de facto segregation. The state does not deliberately, for the most part, segregate students based on race. But we do see a huge difference in the quality of education based on economics and income. If you live in a wealthy suburb of Houston, you're getting a much better education than someone who lives in the inner city in Houston. Because it's property taxes that pay for school districts. The wealthier the area, the better the schools. So the question that is raised is education a civil right? So far, the answer from the federal government and the courts has been no. We do see issues with wealthy versus poor school districts. In 1986, the wealthiest school districts in Texas had $14 million in taxable property. The poorest school district at $20,000. Obviously, there's going to be a big difference in education between a school that can draw from 14 million versus 20,000. So part of the problem is the way we fund education. The use of property taxes creates a vastly unequal system. And so what we see happening is that the state will try to transfer money from the wealthier school districts to the poorer school districts to fix the problem. But the state Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional, saying that it was basically a statewide property tax and that it wasn't going to be allowed. And there were complaints from parents in these wealthier school districts saying, why should my money go somewhere else? It's not my fault I live in a wealthy area and they don't. So they can't do that. They can't take property taxes from the local government and redistribute them to the poorer school districts. So what they've tried to do is use any surplus funding to give poor school districts extra money. In 2006, they were able to give about $10.5 billion to poor school districts. So when the state economy is doing well, usually they'll put a little bit more money into education. They'll try to increase teacher salaries, pause to build new schools, new textbooks, things like that. When the economy is not doing well and school funding dries up, when we went into that national recession in 2008, schools lost a ton of money. And we may see that happening in 2021 because of COVID. The school districts in Texas may not get as much money as they were expecting. So unfortunately, when the state economy is not doing well, education takes a hit. And the students just tend to end up being hurt because of this issue. If the courts ever decided that education was a civil right, we would have to change how we fund education. It could not just be through local property taxes. There would have to be mass federal funding, state requirements. They would have to try and figure out a way to fix major disparities. But for now, the courts have not said it's a civil right. They haven't really said it isn't either, so this is kind of an area where we're still seeing some differences on what exactly is education. Is it a right or not? Okay. Now we're going to talk about what, in my opinion, is one of the worst hate crimes in modern history, overall, but definitely in Texas. In 1998, an African-American man named James Byrd Jr. was walking down a road in Jasper. Not a very big town, he didn't have a car, most people knew who he was. So three white men offered him a ride, and it turned out that at least two of the men were open white supremacists. Rather than giving him a ride, they chained him by his ankles to the truck, dragged him 3 miles down the road, basically ripped his body apart until he died. And then they left what was left of his body outside a historical black cemetery. And when I say this is one of the worst hate crimes in modern history, it was brutal. It was so bad. They found his body in pieces in 81 different places down the road. He didn't die until he hit a culvert and was decapitated. I'm going to show you a couple of photos of the crime scene. It's not anything particularly gruesome, because you don't see that. Trust me when I say you do not want to see that. This this is kind of what we're talking about. Okay, so this is one of the areas of the road where they found a body part. And you can see the blood, right? That's one area. And the other is that's where he was finally killed. So he actually had spray paint where they found body parts along the road. And as you can see there, they spray painted the word head. This is where he actually finally died. Where he was, so all along the road, they had to put like head here, legs, things like that. Again, one of the worst hate crimes in modern history. It got a lot of national attention because this was very, 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 very brutal. So there was a lot of national attention, and there was a lot of fear that racism was back really in Texas. What ended up happening was 3 men were arrested and convicted. 2 were sentenced to death, and the third one, who this was kind of along for the ride and testified against the others, was given life with the possibility of parole in 2038. This marked the second and third times in Texas history that white men were sentenced to death for killing a black man. So Lawrence Brewer was executed in 2011. King was executed on April 24th of last year. So again, horrific hate crime, but the way the state handled it was actually pretty good. They took it very seriously, and the 3 men were very properly punished for this. So 2 of the men are dead, and the third one might get parole in 2038, might not, depending on how the parole board is feeling. In a less horrific case, in Toledo, Texas, there was a scandal where an undercover narcotics agent arrested 46 people in 1999 for drug offenses, all of whom were minorities. Most of the defendants took a plea deal because some of them were facing sentences of 60, 99, and 434 years in jail for drugs. Don't get me started. It turned out that he never produced any drugs or drug paraphernalia for the people he arrested. No drugs were found on these defendants when they were arrested. So it turned out that he'd been lying the entire time. A couple of the people who were arrested were able to say, look, I wasn't even in the state when this guy applied drugs from me. So he ended up going to jail himself. And all of the defendants were released by 2003, and the state paid a settlement to all of the defendants. The fact that juries were willing to listen to a white police officer with no real evidence of drug use or selling by the defendant should tell you something. None of them should have even ended up before a jury, let alone going to jail. Have you heard of the death of James Byrd Jr. before? No? Okay. So, with the death of James Byrd Jr. and all the national attention on Texas, the state legislature decided we got to take a look at the 1993 hate crime law because obviously it wasn't quite strict enough. So there was some backlash to the bill. They said, look, it's redundant, it's unnecessary, and it criminalizes thought. But the reality was that if in 1998 a hate crime that horrific could be carried out, then something had to be done about state law. So one of the concerns that got raised was if you attach a hate crime statute to a charge, does that violate the Equal Protection Clause for victims who are killed not as a result of a hate crime? If you put into place a harsher sentence for killing a black person versus a white person, does this violate equal protection? By and large, the answer has been no. If you deliberately kill someone because of their race, gender, ethnicity, or religion, then that should carry a stronger penalty. So, the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act was signed by Governor Perry in 2001. It did include a hate crime statute. In 2009, President Obama signed into law the Shepard-Byrd Act, named for two victims of hate crimes in 1998. Matthew Shepard was a young man in Laramie, Wyoming, who was gay. He went out to a bar one night, met up with these two guys who beat him and left him tied to a fence. The first person who found him actually thought he was a scarecrow because he didn't look like a human being. And he died later from his injuries. And the other part, of course, is named for James Byrd Jr. So on the federal level, hate crimes do carry a harsher penalty. So if you murder someone because they are Muslim, it's supposed to carry a stronger, harsher sentence. We see this happening in cases with transgender individuals. Transgender individuals are more likely to be murdered, especially transgender women of color. In Dallas, for a while, there was someone killing transgender women of color. I believe there were at least 5 or 6 people who were killed before the cops actually started to connect the dots. Because these groups are at higher risk for assault, rape, and murder, the idea is if you attack someone because of gender, race, ethnicity, or religion, you should get a stronger sentence. There was that case in Austin, I think it was like 2 years ago, where a guy was leaving bombs on the doorsteps of African Americans in Austin and killed at least 2 people that way. He's going to be facing hate crimes charges for that. Right, in terms of how prisoners are treated, throughout most of the 20th century, they didn't have legal rights. And in most states, they were declared legally dead while they were in jail, and then they had to sue the state to be returned to life legally after they were released, which seems excessive, to say the least. And in Texas, there were issues with cruel and unusual punishment, overcrowded jails, lack of health care, physical abuse by the guards and fellow prisoners. There's a federal lawsuit in 1972 against the Texas Department of Corrections, essentially saying, look, you guys are violating their Eighth Amendment rights quite clearly. So the federal court said, you're in violation of the Eighth Amendment. So the federal government took over monitoring our state prisons. Conditions did get better, but there are still questions about the use of private prisons, issues with overcrowding, conditions, of course, in the refugee camps along the borders, things like that. By and large, here in Texas, felons do lose the right to vote. They cannot vote while they are in jail. Once they are released, once they finish their probation or parole period, they are allowed to vote again. Felons cannot vote while in jail. Okay, so there's still a few more slides, but we'll go ahead and end here because I don't really want to start on the death penalty and run out of time. So we'll finish the rest of this on Wednesday. Set aside time on Wednesday to discuss the election, assuming we have any idea who won on Tuesday. We may not know who actually wins the election tomorrow. It may take a couple of days to get everything sorted out. If you haven't voted yet, make sure you vote. The election is tomorrow. And like I said, I don't think we'll know who won necessarily, but I could be surprised. But I don't think we'll actually know who won. So Wednesday, we'll finish the slides, and if we have some idea what happened in the election, we'll discuss that. Otherwise, we'll just talk about civil rights, etc. in Texas. So remember, your papers are due on the 11th by 11:59 p.m. If you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise,